Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear friends of the Austrian Cultural Forum, New York, my name is Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger. I'm the director of the ACFNY, and I'm truly delighted to welcome you tonight in our beautiful auditorium. I am truly delighted that so many renowned experts, international experts, have gathered here tonight and will be here tomorrow for our panel tonight and a symposium tomorrow on a very important topic, science diplomacy in times of global crises. And global crises we do have to deal with. There are so many. I must tell you that I'm personally very much looking forward to an inspiring exchange on the contribution of the world of science to the implementation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm aware of the fact that this is a tall order, but I'm also deeply convinced that scientists, diplomats, politicians, and artists have to join forces to secure livelihoods for future generations in every possible way, by learning from the past and coming up with bold and innovative concepts. Ladies and gentlemen, this interdisciplinary symposium has been conceived as a follow-up to the European Union Horizon 2020 project S4D4C on science diplomacy, which ended in April 2021. And it is also organized as an official side event of the Science Summit of the 78th General Assembly, which will be officially opened next week. And it will also provide input to the United Nations Summit for the Future next year, 2024. Dear friends, achieving peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet, this important principle of the United Nations should also guide our thoughts tonight and tomorrow. Let me conclude by thanking our partners who have made this event possible. First of all, the Center for Social Innovation, Vienna, but also the University for Continuing Education, Krems, beautiful city next to the Danube. Should absolutely visit Krems at your next visit. It's not far from Vienna. And of course also the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance, and of course all their committed teams. I now have the pleasure to introduce to you our two wonderful keynote speakers. Please welcome with me Professor Dr. Eva Schernhammer, Professor of Epidemiology, Head of Department of Epidemiology, Medical University Vienna, Adjunct Professor of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Schernhammer, welcome. We will have a double keynote address tonight, and I'm very happy to welcome Professor Dr. Gerald Steiner, University Professor of Organization, Communication and Innovation of the University for Continuing Education, Krems. Welcome. I would invite both of you to the podium, and then just a piece of information. We will have, after the keynote presentation, a brief pause in order to allow for a technical change. And the evening will finish with a moderated discussion, and I invite all of you also to communicate with our experts in a Q&A session. After that, I invite all of you to join us for a glass of Austrian wine, Grüner Veltliner, as it should be in Austria, and a more personal networking. I wish all of you a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Before we get started, we would like to thank you, Dr. Kepler-Schlesinger, for hosting this wonderful event in this wonderful place here. So, ladies and gentlemen, we were already introduced, and I would like to say also some words in the name of our rector, Friedrich Faulhammer, who regrets not being here today, but he sends his very warm regards. So we are about to dive deeply into complex topics, as every single word of the theme would deserve in-depth discussions on its own. You already mentioned before that we are living in a world where we face not only one crisis, but we face different crises, so-called polycrises. And this is what we consider as complex systems, coupled systems, where it's not only about talking and understanding one crisis, but understanding the interrelatedness of several complex interwoven systems. So based on that, we think that it is particularly the level of values that is kind of providing a basis for having stability in that world of uncertainty, and also some frameworks. You mentioned before the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is already an achievement where we have already a basis and a common understanding for moving forward with that wonderful world. So with respect to the University for Continuing Education, please allow me also in the name of Friedrich Faulhammer to say some words. So for us as an institution, it's very important to go into this topic of science diplomacy. It's a topic that deserves special attention, also because it shows us that it's not only science that can do something for enhancement of the situation we are facing, but it's together. It's diplomacy, it's science, it's mutual learning that we need to consider in order to have progress. So with respect to that, it was also an issue for us to join the European Science Diplomacy Alliance on July 1st. So this was a big step for us, and as mentioned also before, the Horizon 2020 project also provided incredible important basis for us, also contributing to that issue of education and for enhancement. So as the University for Continuing Education, it's important to focus on an issue that is not only related to mainstream education, but continuing education. And that means training of all levels of society. So to mention one example, this is the contribution to a European University initiative, and that was done and is done together with CNAM in France, Andrássy University Budapest in Hungary, University of Ulm in Germany, and Manisa Kilay Bayar University in Turkey. And this is about developing a European university for academic continuing education. We really believe that this is an issue that we need to face, and to have that kind of interrelated aspects of various forms of education and training. So lifelong learning, digitalization, as already mentioned, disruptive technological changes, artificial intelligence, all that is not just like segments, but it's the interrelatedness of all that systems. And actually Eva and myself, we will now go more deeper into that, and based also on a transdisciplinary approach that is also kind of very much characterizing what we are doing at University for Continuing Education. Some of you might know the university, it's Danube University, so we use both names actually also together. And thank you also for introducing Wachau, Krems. This is the region where we not only have education and continuing education, but we have Grüne Veltliner and all that other beautiful things of life. So, transdisciplinarity, science society, science practice, that is actually a kind of a framework that we would like to have in mind when we go now into our joint speech. So it's not a sequence of contributions that we are doing, but Eva and myself, we will kind of have a dialogue based on a presentation and some slides that we brought with us. What is also connecting us, it's a transatlantic endeavor. And we are co-leaders of the Transatlantic Lab on Complex Societal Challenges. So this is actually nicely and directly related to our topic here. So how to deal with complex issues, complex societal challenges. And this actually needs collaboration, and that needs also a transatlantic perspective. This is what we think is extremely necessary. And we go into that just in a minute. So, Eva, I think we should get started.
Yes.
And if you would be so kind and to show our first slides. So.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Yes, very warm welcome also from me, and thank you for the gracious host to have us here. I'm very delighted to be able to talk about this topic, which is so relevant and has become even more relevant in these times of polycrisis. What Gerald and I were thinking to start off with is to introduce briefly our backgrounds that relate to the scientific contents of this, and then get right into materials. So if we can move the slides.
So,
yes.
There.
Maybe Gerald, you start off talking briefly about yours.
Yeah, so in very short, University for Continuing Education consists of 3 faculties, various fields that strongly work together: business, globalization, education, arts, architecture, and health and medicine. So this just is a general orientation. But what is more relevant to today's event are the various labs that are kind of focusing on single challenges. So based actually on that labs, what we see here, they all have more or less a transdisciplinary orientation. As I said before, it's the collaboration between science and society, or between science and practice, or between science and diplomacy to tackle the big challenges we face today. Why is that needed? Actually, because of the complexity that we are facing. So science cannot do it alone. That's a key issue in here. And just to give you some examples, I mean, what we see here, and Eva was mentioning the polycrisis. So that means that, for example, sustainable energy policy or mobility or mineral resource availability is not just like a single issue itself, but it's the interrelatedness. And how to tackle that, this is actually done in that kind of transdisciplinary setting that you also find there, for example, co-leadership between science and practice, or between science and diplomacy. And since Christina Heinzel is also here, Christina, for example, is heading the research lab for democracy and society and transition, and also the sustainability and SDG platform at our university. So this is an example where university is trying to consolidate, to focus scientific accomplishments and the networks and connect it to diplomacy, to connect it to practitioners in order to have a form of mutual learning.
Yes, and briefly about the medical university, and then I will tell you what brings us together, given our very completely different backgrounds. The Medical University of Vienna, in its current form, is stemming from the University of Vienna, which was founded in 1365, so a very old institution. It is affiliated with the General Hospital of Vienna, the AKH, which is the second largest hospital in Europe.
and it has more than 10,000 employees in total and trains about 750 medical students every year, every new class. I myself am chair of the Department of Epidemiology. This is one department of 6 departments in the Center for Public Health, and we do focus on both communicable and non-communicable disease epidemiology. We have a new doctoral program in epidemiology which will start in a few days for the first time. And we have a lot of research ongoing in a fairly small department that has been rapidly growing over the last couple of years. So what brings us together, Gerald and myself? Well, I for myself find the transdisciplinary background that Gerald has very fascinating, and during the pandemic, we started together the lab that Gerald already mentioned, which is the Transatlantic Research Lab, which brought together a couple of individuals from various different backgrounds, a really interdisciplinary, I should say, endeavor. And you can see here the list of the various backgrounds that we had in this group, which essentially comprised individuals, around 10 of us, from both the US side as well as the European side. And what we started doing in this group is dealing with issues that came up during the pandemic and discuss them amongst ourselves and identify those areas that we felt from this really interdisciplinary perspective as interesting and important to work on. So with that in mind, I will show you what we will cover now in the next couple of minutes, half hour or so, to lead you through our thoughts and the findings we have in the bigger scheme of science diplomacy. So we will start off with a little bit of a background on the perception of science diplomacy and what that actually means. And I will ask Gerald to do that, please.
And also to connect this actually to the transatlantic lab. What's important for us is always learning from one crisis, getting the general patterns out of that, the main lessons learned, and then connect it to a bigger picture. And this is actually what we think, what a bigger framework of science diplomacy is also all about. So it's dealing with the complex international challenges, and it's not only in one field, say in climate change, but it's actually this big picture. And so therefore, I mean, how to get that done? So it's collaboration, it's interdisciplinarity, and for those who are in science know that actually interdisciplinarity is not just like something we are used to work in, but actually it's a special effort, it's a special language, and we have not learned it. Most of us were not trained actually in doing interdisciplinary work, and particularly not transdisciplinary work. So this is something that is necessary to do that within science in order to be also capable to have a communication and collaboration between science and diplomacy. And what we also see here, that the situation changed. It's not only a one-sided process, but it's actually mutual learning. There are a lot of things that science can learn from diplomacy. And so to consider that mutuality is important. So it's trust, and we will bring that also in one of the next slides. So how to build that trust, what were the reasons actually why we lost so much trust very often in science, but also in the bigger context of society. So therefore, how to use discourse, how to make mutual learning actually possible is a key issue. And therefore, the role of the universities, the role of other institutions, such as the Center for Social Innovation and others, is important in order to train different levels of society. So therefore, it's not only science for diplomacy, but it's also diplomacy for science. How to establish the appropriate frameworks that allow us to do, for example, a transatlantic collaboration, to do actually science diplomacy. With respect to that, I mean, when we reflect the key agents in that systems, diplomats, scientists, sure, policymakers, but what we also see that there is a kind of extension, other organizations out there, non-profit organizations, but also big players in society. Might be from industry, might be from other fields as well. And the citizens itself. So what about society itself? So getting citizens on board is definitely one of the key issues in here. And as I said, cross-boundary knowledge integration might be something that we need to focus much more on. So it's not only the interdisciplinarity, it's the transdisciplinarity, and how to get understanding together of the crisis, of the complex challenges. So to get the system understanding is crucial here, and you can connect that to collaborative problem solving, and you can connect that to understanding the future. You mentioned the future before, but what about the future scenarios? What are the tools and methods that allow us, not only in disciplines, the medical field, and then to have economics understanding their own picture, but actually the interrelated world. That's the key issue in here. Otherwise, most probably resilience or sustainability of the system might be just an illusion. And in order to have two examples now, let's check and let's get into the example of the Ukraine even.
Yes, I don't want to only, because that's probably what people would expect from me, talk about the pandemic as one of the biggest crises we have experienced in the past. I also first want to start off with the Ukraine war and how that impacted science. And I do think that it's really important to consider these very direct impacts on science that a particular crisis can have on the example of the Ukraine war. There is an article that came out last year in Nature that summarizes the compact impact that you find here. And that stems from, on the one hand, scientists leaving the country for various reasons, on the other hand, destroyed infrastructure, and you also have on the side of the Russians being cut off from international research efforts that they were heavily involved with, where estimates are that all of this is taking back science in these countries by 10 or 20 years in total. There are efforts related to CERN, for instance, and ExoMars, where Russia was involved and is no longer involved, which really puts these projects on a couple of years back. And there is also a setback that could throw, was the estimation in this paper, humanity, and a sizable proportion of humanity. In total, the estimates at 1.7 billion people into poverty and food insecurity because of this war. And I will speak briefly about these really treacherous impacts on science a bit more, but there's also a bit of a positive impact, if you will, which relates to something that Gerald is quite involved with, relating to the efficient use of fertilizers. Gerald, if you want to say a word about that.
Just in very short, there are various initiatives on that issue of global fertilizer challenge. But this is actually not something new. It has been on the research and science agenda since a long time. And what we just found out is that actually in order to deal with that challenge, it also takes, or it needs, a science diplomacy perspective. So why that? Because if we're talking about hunger in one of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's just not sufficient. So we need to understand the comprehensive supply chain from exploration, mining, production, use, recycling measures, all that together. And that's the big challenge. And that is actually calling for a global perspective. So otherwise, the availability of resources and then the issue of hunger in different parts of the world, which cannot, for example, afford fertilizers, becomes a kind of a problem that might not be solved without science diplomacy relationships.
And let's take a minute now to take in the real impact that has happened due to this war on science. Let's look at, for instance, the collaborations. This is on the left-hand side, Ukraine's research collaborations, which are shown in the dark red for the time during the war and in light red 10 years earlier in 2011. And you can see this really substantial shift from a major focus of collaboration with Russia in the past and also with Germany and the United States to a much heavier emphasis on collaboration with Poland, and you will see in a minute why, and also with China to some degree. Likewise, for Russia, on the right side, you can see that there has been a major shift to China as a main collaborator now, and much less collaboration with countries like the United States and Germany. This is just the collaborative ties, but as this really comprehensive article outlines, there have been so many other impacts, and I think it's helpful to look at these various facets in a little bit more detail. For instance, speaking about the infrastructure in Ukraine, the war, it is estimated, has destroyed or really impacted severely about 1/3 of the research infrastructure in Ukraine. You can see that 91 research institutions have been damaged already at that time point and 4 completely destroyed, and it will take a long time to rebuild this infrastructure. As far as retaliation is concerned, looking at the number of scientists who are waiting for research funding, this funding has been shifted to be spent on military expenses so that Ukraine has seen a decline of 50% in terms of their research funding for science. And then you can see that about 89,000 Ukrainian scientists and staff are now working for the military or for causes related to the war and have no more time to work on, I'm behind with these slides here, working on issues related to the military and the war. As far as emigration is concerned, Ukrainians have left the country, I've mentioned it earlier, and have fled to other places. And you see on the left side, Germany and Poland are currently hosting the most number of scientists that have fled Ukraine, 80% of them being women, which in part explains that shift in collaborative efforts that we have seen earlier. I have also mentioned Russia's impact of the situation in the Ukraine. Russia has been cut off in terms of research from many international endeavors. There is also reduced research funding in Russia, and because of the exclusion from global conferences and other international collaborative efforts, young scientists are experiencing throwbacks and are also partially trying to leave the country. Then there is the scientific boycott that has just started to begin in 2022 and is now accelerating, where many more countries are starting to urge an end to academic and research collaborations. And there is, of course, also national endeavors that I've mentioned earlier, like CERN or the ExoMars project that is no longer able to be participated by Russia. MIT, for instance, had a Skoltech partnership of $300 million that has, for instance, been broken. So there are many, many more side effects of this war. And on the right side, it shows what this has meant for Ukrainian science and scientists, and also in Austria, for instance, the FWF, but in many other countries as well in Europe, money has been set aside to be able to host Ukrainian scientists and to be able to support their research. So there has been a large number of fallout from the war in Ukraine. And this war in Ukraine has in part been driven by distrust between individuals and has accelerated, of course, this distrust. And so coming back now to this second topic that I want to talk about, and now with a bit more of a focus on the pandemic. Yes, so just moving forward to this slide here, which basically shows us also from 2022 what a decline in trust in science has happened over the time, to just also pull our attention to the importance of this topic. You see in the green line, these are the people who have hardly any trust in science. Was a small number, 6% before the pandemic, and has gone up to 13% during and after the pandemic. And likewise, a great deal of trust in science was always a high proportion, around almost 50%, and has fallen to 39% after the pandemic. So this exemplifies the extent to which science trust has been impacted. But what about trust in general? And I want to show you some data that we have collected during the pandemic as part of this transatlantic research lab that Gerald mentioned earlier. And what you see here is a timeline to just point out the time points when we collected data. The first batch of data was collected right after the first lockdown in Austria in 2020. So in June, the first lockdown ended in May, if those of you remember from Austria. And the second batch of data was collected a couple of months later, at the end of November 2020, at the end of the second lockdown in Austria. So you remember these pictures here. And here are some of the findings from these surveys that were conducted. First of all, the willingness to adhere to corona measures has declined over time. We know that, but this is also here in numbers to show how the decline has happened. If there were 65% who were totally willing to adhere to corona measures after the first lockdown, this has gone down to 46% a couple of months later. This general willingness to receive a vaccine against corona was asked at a time when the vaccine wasn't even available yet. And what you see here is that a sizable proportion, even back then, was not very willing to receive such a vaccine. In red, you see those who were very unlikely, 26.2%, and rather unlikely, 14.9%. So we are here now, so apologies, yeah. And so there's a big correlation between the willingness to receive a vaccine and adhering to corona measures. So take a look at the bottom here. You see those are the ones who were not at all willing to get a vaccine and were also not adhering very much to corona measures. And that's 80% of all individuals who had this overlap there between these two items. And so we started to look at correlates of vaccine hesitancy, and we found that there were a couple of characteristics in a given population like this. Here, this is an Austrian population that correlated with being not willing to receive a vaccine. It was things like gender, but also age, and then the area of residence, and then things like education and voting behavior also. And this prompted us to ask them, the participants of these surveys, whether they trusted the Austrian government to provide a safe vaccine. And what we found is that a large proportion, again, rather did not trust the Austrian government to provide a safe vaccine. So then we took another deep dive into this topic of interpersonal trust, and we conducted a survey in the DACH region. This is all German-speaking Austrians, Germans, and Swiss individuals who participated in these surveys. And we used a scale, the interpersonal trust short scale, to assess trust on an individual level, and then correlated it with a number of different factors that we also assessed. And what we found is that individuals who were older, who were male, who were participants coming from Switzerland, who had a university degree and had higher income or higher work satisfaction were those who had higher interpersonal trust. Most strongly associated with interpersonal trust was, interestingly, optimism. And then also, having voted in the last elections versus not voting at all, it didn't matter what people voted for, but just even this behavior of going to an election and vote was correlated with higher trust. Perspective taking, also being more extrovert, more agreeable, and scoring higher on a complexity thinking score were all correlated with higher trust. And by contrast, in this sample of about 3,000 individuals from these 3 countries, those with the lowest levels of interpersonal trust were people who were more conscientious. Also, interesting lifestyle variables correlated with this, like being a current smoker or having sleep problems, and scoring high on a conspiracy belief. Like I said, this was a study that was conducted through the Transatlantic Research Lab that we had initiated. And this issue of trust leads us to now wanting to talk more about complex systems so that we can perhaps at the end come back to it and try to come up with an explanation and consequences. So Gerald.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, what is an issue is that we have altogether different pictures of reality. And you might know about that story here, you know. It's that issue when in that kingdom, the king is confronted with something new, something that was never there. We see it's an elephant, but they didn't know. So that was the first time that something like that appeared there. So what he did, he asked the scientists, or you can say here, the blind, wise experts, so what is it? And that reminds us a little bit on various complex situations, right? So we are confronted with COVID. We were not totally sure what it is all about. And so therefore you ask the various disciplines, you ask virology, you ask epidemiology and the different fields. So what is it? And you get different answers, different perceptions. And when we are aware of that, we also see a new challenge of science. It's science who has to provide a better understanding about that peculiarities and also to communicate the issues. So what is it? What is the shared perception? What is the shared mental model that we have of a phenomena such as a crisis? And how are then different forms of crisis related? So when it's not only about one elephant, so therefore it's the complex system that counts and not so much the simple and the complicated ones. And that means when you have a look here to the right bottom side here, the difficulty that we face here is not only that the target state of a system is kind of uncertain and unknown, it's also what happens in between. What about the interventions? What about, say, for example, some occurrences such as natural catastrophes, you know, occurring like we see it right now in Morocco, as we saw it in Turkey. So that are things that kind of disturb the system. And even to make it more complicated, even in the situation right now, in the current state, it's very difficult to understand what's going on. So we are not living in that kind of deterministic world. And therefore, I mentioned before, we need some kind of orientation and we need methodology in order to synthesize that forms of different perspectives to a joint common understanding. It might be a supply chain. And when we look, for example, at the supply chain perspective at the global level, that calls for collaboration between countries, between different levels of society, and between science practice, science diplomacy in mutual manners. So therefore, a kind of needed system thinking needs to be considered. And when we don't do that, we might just see the fish, a single fish, but it's maybe the bigger one, and it's maybe a pattern. And it's the pattern of the swarm, it's the pattern of the crisis that we have in mind, and that was also the reason why we started with a single crisis such as COVID, moved further on to issues such as when we are not trustful anymore, when we moved then to conspiracy, and then also to resource availability. So to understand that, and that is maybe already a bridge to arts. So how to understand what's going on there? Is that kind of, where was it? Sorry.
Yeah, this doesn't work as planned, so it's just a static picture.
Okay,
sorry.
That's not a problem. So when we are thinking about the pictures, and when we're thinking about comprehensive systems, art can be a first step here in order to get to a system understanding, system modeling, which, for example, then leads to simulations that help us for orientation, not in science only, but for diplomacy, to understand the dynamics in the system. Can you just? So, playfulness, is this about kids? Some of you might know that. That's, for example, Lego Serious Play. And this is something that is not only done, in kindergarten, but it is done actually with decision makers at various levels. So how to integrate that forms of perception in order to get a comprehensive picture is actually what we have in mind here. Okay, so when we just move a little bit further on, please. More? Yeah, that's the issue that we want to avoid. What you see here, and this is something that we very often see in real-world cases, this is that actually the perception of a complex system is very much different between the scientists, between the practitioners, between the citizens, and we see that over and over again. And the issue is not, that scientists are ignorant. For example, here you see the scientists with the red profile on a particular situation of transition, and then you see other groups such as households, businesses, and youth. And they are different. So why is that? It reminds us a little bit, and parents who say, I just want to do the best for my kids. But maybe what the kids would like to have is different. And so something similar is also occurring here at that stage. And yeah, one could say maybe, it's particularly very often, maybe it's a man issue. We look into the mirror and we don't see the cat, we see the big tiger. So that kind of misperception is also something. And this is what actually science also needs to provide solutions. We have solutions, but we need to build the bridge, say for example to cognitive science, to understand implicit, explicit associations that we have in mind. And that is a difficulty because, political science, economists, medical science, cognitive scientists, how to bridge that? And we have the tools, but we are still not good in putting that all together in one process, into one toolbox. Yeah, and that's now not a big surprise, but it is an issue because what we also saw in our study is that when you ask people, so what do you expect actually, it's that more than 90% said that for the complex issues out there, we need a strong collaboration between practice, diplomacy practice, and science. Just to put it in a nutshell, so what we see here, and that's maybe something where we can say a transdisciplinary process within science diplomacy might be helpful. So you see in the upper part the discourse, the collaboration between different disciplines. You see in the lower part the discourse between different stakeholder groups, and you see in the middle a kind of emerging that both elements together. And that's the kind of art that we need, how to do a knowledge integration with respect to the challenges that we face in respect to crisis. Just in very short, I think, and this is something where we should kind of reflect in science. We have here representatives of citizen science, We have here representatives of science diplomacy, living labs and all that. And it's not so much about deciding just on one issue and saying, okay, I belong to that school, but it's the issue of being aware about the opportunities of various schools of collaboration and then deciding what is actually the most useful and the most sufficient manner to work together. What you see here, just as an explanation, is that we have on the horizontal axis the relevance for praxis, for practice, for the application. On the vertical axis, you see the relevance for science, so for research itself, and you see on the z-axis the process ownership. And all three need to be considered in order to have an orientation about application. So, Ivo, when we just put that together at the last two slides here, so
it really means that the pandemic wasn't triggering much of the weaknesses that we have, but it was sort of showcasing them. And it showed that there were weaknesses across all scales of coordination, both from local to regional to national and global levels. And then you can speculate about the reasons for this, and there are many reasons. Some of them relate to our educational system, also our cognitive system, where we are not really trained to think in a complex way about complex systems. But then there's also, of course, consequences of our last decades of social, cultural, technological, economic trends, which all have contributed to a very self-centeredness of us, inequalities that we are aware of, polarizations which have contributed to an overall decline in trust, and especially perhaps in these institutions of governance and science. So in short, the pandemic hit the world at a time when it was really in a precarious state, because so many things had been sort of showcasing the weaknesses of our world. So when it comes to science, it can not only have weaknesses that we learned about, for instance, when encountering crises like a war, but it also has something that is working well and could perhaps serve as a role model for a bigger picture. Number one, it operates as a globally coordinated system with highly distributed organization structures and governance structures. This already is working for the most part. It's also honestly quite adaptive. If you think about recent developments like AI, you will hear more about this tomorrow, but open source, reprints, etc., all these developments in the last year, science can rapidly adapt to it. And then collaboration in science, international knowledge exchange has been happening in science already for a long time. To some extent, science also can negotiate its own ethical standards. So, handing back to Gerald now to finish up our presentation here, please.
I mean, just in short, we think the complex issues out there can only be solved if we are aware about the complexity, and that calls for a strong collaboration between science and practice, and it's the mutuality that actually requires a new thinking and maybe also adaptation of some of the thinking paradigms that we are still in. So we just close it like that in order to have also time for discussion.
Dr. Sternhammer, Dr. Steiner, thank you so much for your really fascinating presentation. You covered a lot of ground. We have the French would say du pain sur la planche. We have bread on the plate to discuss, not only tonight, but also tomorrow in our symposium. Thank you very much also for putting Ukraine on very high on the agenda, because this is probably the most important topic for Austrian diplomacy right now. Thank you very much. I ask the public to just wait a little while to change the presentation, and I already see Professor Bourbonas here on the staircase.
Wow.
Well, now I have the pleasure to also introduce Professor Gediminas Urbonas. He's an artist, educator, researcher, and co-founder of US Urbonas Studio together with Nomeda Urbonas. He's an expert on interdisciplinary research and practices that facilitate exchange amongst diverse nodes of knowledge production and artistic practice in pursuit of projects that transform civic spaces and collective imaginaries. And now I have to ask our technician to maybe tone down whatever is coming out of these speakers. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger, and thank you for your introduction, and thank you, Melina Tsiamos, for inviting me, and everyone who are hosting so generously this event, this forum, and Gerald Eva. It is really a great pleasure to share the stage with you. Okay, so we are artists and educators working together and developing research-based practice founded in 1993 when we initiated artist-run space for transdisciplinary research, self-education, and self-organization. Our interest in collective and organizational forms of art is contingent on the social, economic, and political transition that took place in Lithuania, where we come from. Our experience then as students at the Art Academy in Vilnius was marked by the ecological movements provoked by civic and environmental collapse, brought up by Chernobyl ecological disaster and then war in Afghanistan. Within this context, we launched our practice pondering on ecological repair as a response to social crisis and considering art as an infrastructure to sustain ecology and perhaps even democracy. Throughout history, the project of progress and European civilization was realized by draining swamps, marshes, and wetlands, dividing the land into liquid and solid, butchering territory for agriculture, waterways, and settlements, extracting and parceling it by expelling the indigenous and autochthonous. All are technologies of progress and of colonization. As Andrew Pickering argues, to notice the swamp below our feet is to switch to a non-dualist ontology that is more appropriate to Anthropocene. We argue that art and design must embrace the swamp with its hybridity, complexity, queerness, and paradox as a way to decolonize and deschool itself, and also as a way to learn diplomacy. I have to admit, we are intentionally imprecise using the term swamp. Wetlands can have many names: quagmires, marshes, bogs, fens. However, the term swamp stands out for its irritant subject. In the words of Bruno Latour, a swamp is a critical zone as it reached the critical state due to exhaustion as a biotop, and it is critical or even irritant instrument as it cries for a change of perspective by standing critical to our modernist ontology. Long maligned, abused by political rhetoric, drained and extracted for sake of progress, swamps represent arguably the most uncanny place on earth and in the cosmology of modern man. On the way to Inferno, one needs to suffer the swampy, stinking waters of the river Styx and the black goo of the Stygian swamp, in which one can find no joy in God or man or universe, according to Dante. In neither hell or the underworld of chthonic powers, it is mighty swamp, not gentle and soothing bog. The term swamp itself suggests submersion with its connotations of overwhelming muck, of waters closing overhead. This dark place, shapeless and limitless as the universe itself, is an abyss into which we steer. The swamp mirrors the depths of our own imagination, illuminating with ghostly spark like the ignis fatum or will of the wisp. However uncanny the swamp is, it is yet stuck in the habits of political rhetoric that calls for mobilization against anomaly and deviation, as seen in the reiterated refrain of Drain the Swamp, Drenare la palude, as we know it from Garibaldi and Mussolini, as they actively terraformed the Italian landscape. Draining, cleansing, and purifying of swamps, getting rid of things deemed queer or witchy, was not only embedded in the project of fascism, but in the rhetoric of modernity as well. The Cartesian mind of the Enlightenment set a tone in scientific classification, filtering and refining idea of useful knowledge that is in service of European civilization, simultaneously separating and discarding all that is muddy, queer, and obscure. Unless drained, swamps do not lend themselves to extraction. Peaty bogs are fertile of organic compound that is similar to coal just hidden under the water. Growing extremely slowly, sphagnum moss turns into peat, arguably the best carbon sink on the planet Earth. However, the benefits of swamps to bioservices exceed tropical forests or even oceans. Their value cannot be limited to economic terms only. The swamp's relationship to human settlements is also complex. The very project of urbanization owes its sprawl to the swamps, draining and pushing the swamps to the margins of humanity and humans to the margins of the swamps produces recursivity of swampification as a cyclic contingency of extraction and expulsion, as in the words of Saskia Sassen. The dual ontology of the swamp is in a crux of this inquiry, situating the swamp in the center of lineage of visionary artistic cybernetic experimentation started by Gordon Pask and Stafford Beers in the 60s. Their insights bring to our attention the interaction of life forms and the modeling of balance that inspired management of complex processes in human society. Self-organizing systems lie all around us. They are quagmires, the fish in the sea, or the intractable systems like clouds. Surely we can make these things work out for us, act as our control mechanisms. Or perhaps most important of all, we can couple these seemingly uncontrollable entities together so that they can control each other. Why not, for example, couple the traffic chaos in Chicago to river systems in New Orleans in order to obtain an acceptably self-organizing whole? The cybernetic imaginary of the swamp suggests hybrid interfaces and forms of intelligence, which work to orient us towards landing on Earth, not leaving the Earth. We depend on the inhabitability on the Earth, and the idea of liberating ourselves from this dependence belongs to the realm of imagination. To dream of going to Mars, as in Isabel Stenger's writes, is to dream of living in a way dependent on an entanglement of highly sophisticated technologies. Going deeper into the subject of swamps, it becomes apparent that we are dealing with much more than a metaphor signifying unorganized mud. It unfolds as well-organized biosphere and as a library of diverse artistic, cultural, historic, and cybernetic knowledges. As artists, we argue that swamp is a multifaceted lens through which we can look into connections and interdependencies, not only between the life forms and non-living matter, where we can discover the complexity of our symbiotic planet, as insightfully described by biologist Lynn Margulis, but in the assemblage of eclectic sources that are in service of a speculative poetic ontology that sketches possible implications for thinking and acting in the present, as in the words of anthropologist Stuart McLean. The technique of the swamp is an active engagement with the material world, as Ursula Le Guin suggested. Here, the chancy, formless, fluctuating, unreliable, and in the end, unknowable matter that shifts between the modalities from solid to liquid, from liquid to vapor, becomes the focus of our attention. Swamp has history of imagination that represents the place outside the space of culture and civilization. The discomfiting topology of wetlands links the problematic identity of being neither water nor land with an anxiety related to its uncanny nature infested with malaria, miasma, and melancholia. Environmental humanities trace down the feminist locus of wetlands. As the nemesis of knowable patriarchy, wetlands appeared hideous and ghastly, unclassifiable, treated as feminine and mysterious as a womb itself. This is also reason why in the Western cultural imagination, wetlands used to be conceived of primarily as a dystopian places. One could say that swamp marks crisis of modern imagination, and the reimagining of which we're in dire need in order to begin reorienting the dynamic between space and time. In fact, as witnessed by thinkers of imagination from Kant to Sartre, Bachelard, and Simondon, the perception of place is deeply rooted in the techniques of imagination, which exercise the translation from time to space. Imagination morphs these moments of juncture and produces schematics of orientation, which may critically channel new dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. Hence, we would like to conceive the swamp as a locus of imagination, the place of codependencies and correlations, which have frequently been overlooked. Swamps are slow ecosystems, and thus the swamp book is a slow process. Weaving practices and approaches around subject of swamp in an effort to unfold paradox of dialectical tension between the book as both process of thinking and tangible material and as printed object. The Swamp Challenge started from the proposal for the school as a form for the National Pavilion at Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018, where we probe concept of design and architecture developed beyond visuality. Situated in the center of Venetian Lagoon and joined by dozens of schools, collaborators in a number of participants from diverse disciplines, the school develops pedagogical exercises that engage sensorial, immersive, and embodied knowing, to imagine a future learning environment that supports emerging forms and urge us towards change of perspective. To expand the sociability beyond the human, and I will just share a few examples from hundreds and hundreds of events, produced by more than 300 of participants. The tour fiction group from Iceland worked to restore Icelandic vernacular house. The modernization of Iceland led to destruction of these houses. The ecosystem of that house, where the soil, different fungi, bacteria, and microorganisms are co-thriving, is called Torp House's microbiome. The researchers calculated 1,631 bacteria and 697 eukaryotes species in the sample of such house. All these different species contribute to the human immune system, so the humans living in the Torp house under the extreme conditions that Iceland has stay healthy, and this means extremely windy, extremely cold, and wet. The reactivation of practices that both reclaim and presuppose interdependence calls for culture whose seeds can be sown by inquiries, but which must be nourished by the soil in order to grow. Which means that such practices will have to resist the demands of scalability and create their own soil, a mode of making sense in common we could call vernacular, because its words and phrasings set down their roots in this soil. Swamp intelligence is conceived in collaboration with Jonas Kubilius, AI scientist, and probes alternative visioning that merges artistic, scientific investigations in an emergent forms of intelligence. The swamp intelligence is based on AI algorithm that uses white noise to generate hybrids of natural and architectural imagery uncanny to human perception. Machine itself decides what is architecture and what is nature, and by accepting or denying, and creates the path of thinking, that leads to the form. The project engages metabolism of the ecosystem, where muddy and machining organically merge with digital life forms. So for us, this argument that swamp is an intelligent system, not just unorganized mud, was in the core of this experimentation. With the Swamp Observatory installed in the Critical Zones exhibition in 2020, during the pandemic, we are responding to Latour's challenge to engage with the critical zone proposition and reconceptualize geography, or what he is calling Gaiagraphy. Epigenetic model we are proposing explores holobiontic relationship between natural, cultural, material, and immaterial nodes, raising our awareness of its networked relationship. And finally, the exploratory swamp game Eat Me, developed with members of MIT Climate Vision group, invites users to experience the symbiotic relations unfolding in the trembling swamp. As we discussed earlier, swamp is a perfect milieu to sense fragile interdependencies between the organisms and their habitat. Here, every member of the community is part of every other member's environment, as well as necessary for the survival of the whole. The game probes the change of perspective and allows us to embody different species by touching swampian creatures, plants, insects, birds, amphibians, fungi, bacteria, or algae, and discover the main rule of cannibal metaphysics: to become the other, you have to be eaten. The game experiments with the biotop model of Aukštumalos Mor, where German botanist Karl Albert Weber conducted the world's first scientific study on wetlands. The creatures dwelling in the game are inspired by Weber's drawings, as well as informed by scientific data that is collected by biologists. Swamp game transcends the Darwinian logic of survival of the fittest and offers the user a chance to embody different species and thus change variety of perspectives. And now I have to somehow play this. Carlos, could you help me to play this file? Could you help me to play this file? Thank you. So this is very short clip, and we are finishing. Yeah. And meanwhile, while Carlos is trying to play back this file, I will finish by saying that the messy and irritant swamp gives us an opportunity to test idea of symbiosis, collectively forming and becoming together in order to find new ethos of coexistence as a way that recognizes political and political power of ecologies around us. And this would be what diplomats would convey, not models or arguments, but activators of the imagination, incentives to expand the scope of the possible reinvention of new ways to formulate problems, freed from the scalable state-imposed imperative. Thank you. Well, there is no sound, so I mean, it's pity Mouse on Mars, you know, our collaborators, you know, so would be nice maybe to hear this German electronic music duo and their spatial sound, but I can. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Obonas, for this really fascinating presentation and for your walk through nature and the undiscovered areas of swamps. I now invite Professor Katja Meyer and all her panelists to come on the podium. To introduce Professor Katja Meyer to you. She is a sociologist. She's sitting here in this beautiful blouse, and she works at the interface of science, technology, and society since 2019. She is working as a senior postdoc with the Elise Richter Fellowship program at the Department of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Vienna. Her research focuses on the interaction between social science methods and their public spheres. Her list of publications is quite long and very impressive. In addition, Katja also works as a senior scientist at the Center for Social Innovation in Vienna, and she's an associate researcher at the University of Vienna's platform Responsible Research and Innovation in Scientific Practice. She also works at the University in Lucerne and in the Carnegie Mellon University of the United States here on our continent. I have to cut a very, very long and impressive CV short, and I'm sure that Katja will tell you more about her work. I now invite Katja to moderate our final panel discussion for tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope, this is on. A lot of things were presented tonight. Thank you very much for these wonderful presentations, talking basically about ways to tackle the global futures. And I think you have shown how actually that there are quite many not only opportunities but also approaches to this and how this can be done. I think I've made some notes, and I just want to go through them very, very briefly before I can ask my first question, and then we will immediately open questions for the audience as well. So actually, you mentioned science is a global system already in place, that could be used much better to tackle global challenges. And so what came to my mind immediately, science is a global system, although with very different access to resources and power. And it's also adaptive, that is true. It is adaptive in terms of topics and also in innovation in methods, but not so much in giving merit to transdisciplinary research, cooperating with artists, and so on and so on. So the scientific system is quite strict in its ways how to say what good performance is in science, and it's normally measured by publication outputs, by patents and things like this, and certainly not in the things that you were telling us today, which I find, of course, is a big mistake of the science system. And so my first question would go into this direction, and I would like to ask, before we come back to the swamp, I want to come back to the swamp effectively afterwards, but I want to ask you, what would be necessary also when we think about this global perspective on science and the necessity to adhere much more to this global perspective? What would be needed also in terms of science diplomacy to change this kind of reward system in science so that we can actually do these kind of important things that you are already doing?
Thank you so much. I think things already changed. So, for example, when we look back, for example, year 2000, the opportunities for doing transdisciplinary research were really kind of bad. And as you say, it was not easy to publish work like that. But there are two things that changed the things, how we are doing research here. So the one is the possibilities already changed. So now transdisciplinary work is kind of grown up. So you can publish it. For example, the Transatlantic Group, I mean, doors to Lancet are open. Sustainability science, BNAS, I mean, that was kind of unbelievable to get into that kind of track. And I think it's just the necessity of reality that showed, as I said at the beginning, science cannot do it alone. However, I think we have to try to do a good, rigorous science. And that is something that we have to be aware of. So transdisciplinarity is not replacing strong disciplines. So I think that's also a first issue. So strong disciplines are the basis for doing good interdisciplinary work. And good interdisciplinary work and having a systems framework. And what we heard also in the last presentation, to understand the system, to understand adaptive capacities, and all that together allows us then to also have a new setting for transdisciplinarity. So the next step is definitely also a better evaluation. When does it make sense to do processes like that? And this is actually where we are right now.
Would you like to add something, like from your personal experience with working in this transatlantic transdisciplinary lab?
Yeah. I also wanted to add, of course, I agree with you. I also am struggling with the many shortcomings that are in the scientific organization, and it's every day something else that comes up where you think this could be much improved. But what I do want to emphasize also is science is striving for more equity with the public access, for instance, to now also allow researchers from countries where they wouldn't have had access to the publications of their colleagues. And I think more could be done in terms of access to internet, for instance, which is so vital for our work nowadays. But from my own perspective, working with the Transatlantic Research Group, I will say it was a delightful experience and continues to be, because we work in our silos, especially in medicine. We have our specialties in which we stick very much. We know the colleagues, and it can become very one-sided, the type of research we do. So for me, the most refreshing thing is the questions that are being asked in our group that are sometimes using a different language, and to even be able to identify, that's what you mean, you call it that way, in our language it's this. And then to come up with new research ideas and have the strong backup of the various methods that each of us uses. So for me, I think it's totally enriching, and I almost feel like every scientist should at least in part have that experience or that exposure to the different disciplines in a much more systematic way. And this may impact how we educate future scientists, perhaps to facilitate it, but I find it hugely enriching, and I think it's also a bit of a learning model for the pandemic. If I think about my work as part of GECO in Austria, which was this advisory group to the government, it was in some sense a very interdisciplinary, well, actually transdisciplinary group. And coming to the trust issue, it worked within the group that people trusted each other for the most part, and I found that collaboration also very effective. Unfortunately, GECO was established towards, I would say, the end of the pandemic in some sense, so it couldn't really play out its major strengths, but I think that's the way to do it if you want to have effective science diplomacy, to come up with a group of scientists who are trusting each other, are from different disciplines and learn their languages and can sort of together develop a vision that can be recommended to the government.
So sometimes inner scientific diplomacy is needed, basically transdisciplinarity diplomacy is needed, or better science communication, and it always takes a lot of time until this kind of transdisciplinary language has been found, right, across all the stakeholders, across the participants of such projects or initiatives. And that is often underestimated, how much time this also takes, right, to establish this trust. And you're absolutely right, as soon as there is a group of people from very different backgrounds showing the outside that they trust each other, then it's much easier to create also trust in the communication with the public. I think this is a very important point. Before I really want to come to the learnings, how also the swamp might help us to better establish transdisciplinary perspectives and global perspectives, and also ecological, globally ecological perspectives. I want to come back once more to the question of, because you mentioned it, and I think it's also another important point for science diplomacy, the example of the war in Ukraine. and the examples that you brought where science has already reacted or had some solutions in place already for kind of at least helping or placing some solidarity initiatives. And I think what would be your take on the importance of also having these kind of scientific infrastrucures already in place, global or international scientific infrastructures like the Marie Skłodowska-Curie program, for example, that then found placements for Ukrainian and also I think even Russian scientists. So do you think there is more science diplomacy needed, also pushed by scientists, that such international organizations are in place that can actually help in times of crisis, not only to share knowledge, like we saw in the pandemic, but also to guarantee the flowing of knowledge across borders by the mobility of researchers?
I will briefly say I am fully supportive of this becoming much more centerpiece in the way we support scientists. And I'm thinking of it, and probably Gerald can say more to that, from the complexity standpoint. We do have complex systems that we're dealing with that are leading to various crises because we haven't fully understood sometimes the systems. So if we enable through funding mechanisms that can more quickly react, as was the case during the pandemic, for instance, versus usually taking 2 years from idea conception to having a project funded and then starting to execute it. So if this can be accelerated and be much more across disciplines and considering these various approaches that bring in non-scientists as well, I think that can only be beneficial in the longer run. And I'm pretty sure that that's the direction we will be heading. And I will hand to Gerald.
Funding has to change there as well.
So funding is definitely also a big issue, but say, for example, I think diplomacy can build bridges, should build bridges, and with respect to what you just asked us, I think there's one dimension that is very often forgotten, that is also building bridges between the different age groups. So it's not only about the kids, it's about the adults. And when we have a look to Austria and the DACH region, I think it's very often a kind of waste of resources when we retire people just strictly at 65 years. So that's the issue, you know. There are people, that's knowledge. I mean, the brains are working well. People are working like great people in sports, you know. I mean, you are not, I mean, maybe you are at the peak when you are 70. And so the issue is not like doing something just for the elderly population, but bringing the elderly and the young ones together. And I think this is something. And when you look, for example, in the Transatlantic Lab, we have the young ones, we have the old ones. Very often in the Transdisciplinarity Lab, I'm very lucky that, for example, in Germany, great brains are retired, and they, you know, for example, are 75, they are 80 years old, and I bring them together with the young ones. And that's a powerful couple, you know, to have my youngest one in one of the labs is 82, the youngest because he's just, you know, he just entered the lab. And the young one he's working together with is 24. Oh, that's great, because both have to contribute something. So it's not just like doing something playful. Playfulness is good, but the young one has the access, you know, to the whole data science, you know, has so many new thoughts. And the senior is having so much experience and curiosity. So what they both have so much in common is the curiosity and is appreciating the other. And when I look to my friend to the right side, MIT did a wonderful job, you know, with Forrester, who said, I mean, when people get to MIT and I teach them then systems thinking, it's already too late, and please correct me, but I mean, he said, start in kindergarten. And this is something where I think, you know, science diplomacy, we really need to rethink our whole educational system And the point is, we need to think already, what's going on in kindergarten and all the steps forward, and then make that powerful couples. And what I also think is we are just too much segmented. And I can reflect on that based on I'm the dean of the School of Business and Globalization, but we need the big picture. And we just separate, the disciplines, and then say, for example, you do a little bit now education in marketing, and then you get into strategy, and then you have all the islands. I think it's good to be good in the islands, but it's also necessary to be good in the overall composition, and this is what we have to have in mind. So, therefore, I think the framework needs to be different. And for example, opportunities out there, great ones. We're talking about transatlantic. Yeah, so what about establishing frameworks that allow students from both sides of the Atlantic to work together? We are not good in that. So it shouldn't be done just there in Boston, and then, over there in the valley, and then some work in the DACH region. I think, we lose a lot of energy and momentum when we don't make use of that couples. So the ages, but also across the ocean. We have digitalization, we have the means out there. Why don't we do it? I would like to see more opportunity where my students are working together with the students from Boston on joint issues. Say, for example, coupled human systems. What about the climate crisis? What about biodiversity loss? What about trust in society? So that shouldn't be done in islands, and we still do it. So I think diplomacy could support us very much in that. And that's, having programs, having scholarships out there. And that would be easy. Not much additional funding is needed for that, but providing more framework.
Sorry. Because the next question would be so you mean the, sorry. Yeah, you have one. Okay, great. So the internationalization, sorry for you, it's on your leg, sorry for that. The internationalization also of the education system and the opportunities also in not only in research but also in education for these kind of exchanges. Yeah. So let me please come, as I already said in the beginning, back to the swamp thing, because of course this is a fascinating imaginary that you provided us with. You called it yourself the locus of imagination, and I think a swamp can serve a lot of things. But my question to you would now be, because Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger opened this evening with this hint to the importance of the SDGs and also the need for diplomacy to create a better understanding for the SDGs. If you would now have the opportunity to use the swamp and maybe the game and maybe other things that have been developed in relation to the swamp imaginary with a group of international diplomats that are there to better, or that need to better understand not only the SDGs but also to need to establish a certain language to understand science. What would be your priority for the swamp to kind of swamp on the diplomatic playground?
Thank you. So not getting back, as you suggested, the swamp, but getting to the future.
Yes,
the future swamps. I think, as Latour suggested, that we never been modern, so the science of diplomacy, and this is also Isabel Stenger's writes, is actually grounded on the ability to be obliged, to ability to be indebted, and we were talking about the trust, but diplomacy is actually pre-modern, and the science and the art, not science, but the art of diplomacy is the ability to engage the unknown and to accept the unknown and to accept something that is unpredictable and unstable also. So to live with the condition of instability, I would say this is the first perhaps rule of the swamp, that it is constant condition of instability, it is constant condition of hybridity. Moderns introduced the idea of filtration and purification. For us, it is very difficult to accept the hybridity. For us, it is very difficult to accept something that is neither water nor the land. So something that is queer and witchy, right? And this is what perhaps that would be the first lesson, to embrace the instability as the future condition, not as the condition that needs to be tamed and stabilized, right? But to adapt to instability.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some diplomats will probably have their own experiences of instability every day in their practices. So it would be a wonderful experience, I think, if they could also be trained in the swamp, if you like. And I wonder how such a setting should look like, because sometimes I also go to a lot of events also in citizen science, but also in art and science and so on. But those events normally happen either in a museum or at a festival or in a school, maybe, yeah? But they nearly never happen at the United Nations headquarters or something like that. So I wonder whether the swamp could be something that should be installed there as a teaching or training ground.
You are provoking me, because back in 2011, together with my colleague Tracy Ward, curator from Britain, we organized that symposium where all the participants who were specialists of riparian culture, studying from specialists who are researching underwater plants and or who also professor from Oxford who is the best specialist of fluid dynamics, people who are working with estuaries, people who are working with as from sociology perspective, kind of like working with communities who sort of like are based at these riparian territories. So we had conditioned that all the professionals coming to the vet symposium would need to jump into the river, right? So there will be no dry condition and PowerPoints and computers, but we all would need to sort of like jump into the river and be wet. And this is the condition of the vet symposium. Of course, it sounds like a big fun, and it is a playground, but it is also for us opportunity to acquire different perspective. Not to stay in the environments that are safeguarded and isolated, and with the purified air and filtrated, right? But to be in the environment that inspires us to change the habits of thought.
I can see interesting events coming up here in this kind of prolongation of what you were saying.
I truly believe that context changes our thinking.
Yeah. So I think we have to wrap up. Is that correct? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Don't underestimate the training of diplomats. I just talked to one of my colleagues. She will be sent to Turkey as our new ambassador, and she just came back from a training with our military for hostile situations, and she would had to spend a full day with Austrian special forces in Waldviertel in a special training area, equipped with mosquito spray, and they actually had to work their way through the jungle of the Waldviertel. So yes, this scenario is very realistic.
So maybe that would be an entry point, to do these kind of trainings.
I would like also to comment, because what provoked me to think to today offer you this invocation about the swamp was a letter that I received at the start of the war in Ukraine by Ukrainian scholar and researcher who wrote me saying, I read about the forthcoming book Swamps and the New Imagination, and I'm thinking, he is writing, and I'm thinking about the role of swamps and wetlands in the war in Ukraine, and the wetlands really playing a huge role. And he's writing, how can we think about a swamp that swallows the tank, right? Sort of like, and But at the same time, there is also this not only topology of the swamp, sort of like that can swallow perhaps all the military-industrial complex, but also for us to think about this reverse process of swampification, with the explosion of the damp, as you know, and with all this kind of like also pollution that is done to the bodies of water, right? So we have these two kind of like processes where the swamps, perhaps could help us to really negotiate a diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a very good end point. As we have to wrap up, I'm really sorry that we cannot take any questions from the audience right now, but there will be an opportunity with the Grüne Veltliner that was proposed to us in the beginning, downstairs I think it is, to ask questions directly to our distinguished panel. So thank you very much for coming and have a good evening.